My parents backed my brother until everything collapsed. Then they came to me for help, but what I did next left them speechless. I'm a 30-year-old man, and I've always felt like the odd one out in my family. My younger brother, Ethan, who is 28, has been the golden child for as long as I can remember. I used to think it was just in my head, but over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It's not just the little things, it's been a constant from our childhood to now. Looking back, I don't know if I should have done something earlier, or if it would have even mattered. Growing up, Ethan and I had a pretty typical sibling dynamic, at least that's how it probably looked from the outside. But even as kids, it was clear who my parents doted on. For my 8th birthday, I got a modest cake and a set of secondhand toys. 2 months later, Ethan got a backyard carnival for his 6th birthday, complete with a clown, face painting, and pony rides. I remember sitting there, staring at my slice of cake and realizing it wasn't just about the party, it was about what it symbolized. In school, the difference was even more obvious. When Ethan struggled with a subject, my parents hired the best tutors money could buy. When I aced my classes, they'd say something like, "You're so smart, you don't need help." I think they genuinely believed it was a compliment. The final blow came when I won a regional academic competition in high school. It was a big deal, one of those events where they handed out trophies and invited the local press. My parents promised to attend, but at the last minute, they skipped it. Ethan had a soccer game that same day. Then came college. I worked hard to get into a decent school and relied on loans to pay for it. My parents didn't contribute a cent, but they cheered me on as I signed the papers that would leave me in debt for years. Ethan's experience was the exact opposite. My parents covered his full tuition and bought him a car as a graduation gift. It wasn't even subtle. I remember asking my mom why they couldn't spare anything for me, and she brushed it off, saying, "It's just different with Ethan." Fast forward to adulthood, I worked hard, saved every penny, and bought my first home in my late 20s. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. Ethan, on the other hand, drifted from one job to another, usually quitting within a year. He'd call my parents for help every time he ran into financial trouble, and they always bailed him out. When I asked for advice during my home buying process, they barely paid attention. Meanwhile, they co-signed a loan for Ethan to buy a house that was way out of his budget. It didn't take a crystal ball to see where that was headed. My wedding was another eye-opener. I'm not one to expect handouts, but it stung when my parents told me they couldn't contribute because things were tight. A month later, they gifted Ethan $20,000 for his future wedding, even though he wasn't even engaged at that point. I started pulling away. I still loved my family, but I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't being treated as less important. The family business was another sore spot. My parents run a small but successful business that I helped grow over the years. I'd spent countless weekends helping out, even as a kid. When I got older, I pitched ideas to expand the business, many of which paid off. But when I asked about a formal stake in the company, they laughed it off. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had no involvement, was promised the entire business in their will. The breaking point came about a year ago. Ethan defaulted on his house loan after losing yet another job, and my parents called me. They didn't just ask for advice, they expected me to help bail him out. When I refused, my dad said something that still echoes in my head: "Family comes first." I hung up the phone and cried, not because of what they said, but because I finally realized where I stood. Since then, I've started therapy and focused on building a life where I don't rely on their approval. I landed a big promotion, started traveling, and even got back into hobbies I'd forgotten about. But my family's drama isn't over, not even close. Ethan's poor decisions have only made things worse for my parents, and it's clear the tension is reaching a boiling point. Not long after I shared my story, things started spiraling faster than I could have imagined. Ethan came up with his latest grand idea, a business plan for a luxury lifestyle service. He claimed it would be a subscription-based app offering access to high-end events, private jets, and exclusive deals. It sounded like something pulled from a late-night infomercial, but he pitched it to my parents like it was a guaranteed goldmine. I wasn't surprised when my parents backed him. What did shock me was how far they were willing to go. They drained a significant portion of their retirement fund to invest in Ethan's app idea. It wasn't just the money, they also co-signed another loan for him, using their house as collateral. When I found out, I couldn't stay silent. I pointed out Ethan's long history of failed ventures and irresponsible spending, but my parents brushed me off. They said I was being unsupportive, that I should be happy Ethan was trying to build something for his future. Predictably, Ethan's business fell apart within 6 months. He didn't do any market research, had no concrete business plan, and wasted most of the funds on flashy marketing stunts that didn't pan out. He even leased an expensive office space that he couldn't afford after the first quarter. When it all collapsed, he claimed the economy was to blame, and my parents swallowed his excuses whole. Meanwhile, my parents started showing signs of financial strain. They stopped eating out and canceled a vacation they'd been planning for months, but they still wouldn't hold Ethan accountable. Instead, they started talking about how unlucky he was and how hard it is to run a business these days. Things came to a head at a family gathering. Ethan showed up and acted like nothing had happened. He was laughing, eating, and even bragging about how his next idea would be the one to really take off. Someone casually asked why the first one hadn't worked out, and Ethan turned to me, saying, "Well, maybe if certain people had been more supportive, things would have gone differently." That comment hit a nerve. I stood up and laid everything out in front of everyone, how I'd worked hard for everything I had, never asked for a dime, and still got no recognition from my parents, while Ethan had been handed chance after chance and still managed to blow it every time. The room went dead silent. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door on his way. After that, my parents started reaching out to me more frequently, but it wasn't for emotional support. They wanted money to help cover Ethan's debts. My dad called me one evening and casually mentioned how they were falling behind on the loan payments for their house. He hinted that I should step in since family always helps family. I stayed calm and explained that I couldn't, especially considering my own financial goals. When I reminded him of how they had refused to help me during my hardest times, he quickly ended the conversation. The extended family started to notice the cracks. My aunts and uncles, who had always been polite but distant at gatherings, began to speak up. One of my aunts called out my parents directly, saying it was obvious they had always favored Ethan and now they were paying the price. I didn't even know some of my relatives had noticed until they started pulling me aside to share their thoughts. It was oddly validating, but it didn't change the fact that my parents were still firmly in Ethan's corner. Ethan, of course, couldn't let things go quietly. He took to social media, posting vague updates about how he was being sabotaged by people who were supposed to support him. He didn't name me outright, but it was obvious to anyone who knew us. Some of his friends chimed in with supportive comments, but others asked pointed questions about what really happened. The posts eventually fizzled out when he realized they weren't gaining the sympathy he'd hoped for. In the meantime, therapy became my lifeline. I was learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, which was easier said than done. Still, I kept my focus on my own life and tried not to get pulled into the chaos. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from an old family friend. She'd seen one of Ethan's social media posts and reached out to tell me she admired my independence and had always felt I'd been treated unfairly. It wasn't a big gesture, but it felt like a small win. Things took another turn when Ethan was forced to move back home. With his business debts piling up and no steady income, he couldn't afford his rent anymore. My parents welcomed him back with open arms, but it didn't take long for tensions to build. Ethan started asking them for more money to get back on his feet, and my parents began bickering over how much they could realistically give him. I thought things couldn't get messier, but I was wrong. My parents started reaching out again, dropping hints about how their finances were worse than they'd let on. They wanted me to step in, not just to help Ethan, but to keep their household afloat. I held my ground, knowing that giving in would only enable the cycle to continue. Now, with Ethan back home and the financial strain worsening, the cracks in my family's foundation are turning into full-blown fractures. And just when I thought things couldn't unravel further, I stumbled upon a family secret that could change everything. Things started unraveling in a way I couldn't have imagined. While Ethan settled back into my parents' house, comfortably avoiding any responsibility for his failures, I stumbled across something that changed everything. A distant cousin reached out to me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in years, but he mentioned hearing about the family drama and wanted to check in. During the conversation, he casually brought up the family business. Specifically, he asked if I knew that Ethan's house had been purchased using the business as collateral. At first, I thought he was mistaken. Why would my parents risk the business for Ethan's house, especially when it was clear he couldn't handle his own finances? But the more we talked, the more it started to make sense. It explained why my parents were suddenly struggling so much financially. I did some digging, and it didn't take long to confirm the truth. The business loan Ethan had defaulted on was secured using the family business as collateral. Now, with the loan in default, the business itself was in jeopardy. My parents hadn't mentioned a word of this to me, not during their calls for help, not during their hints about needing money, not ever. I confronted them about it during a visit. My dad tried to play it off, saying it was a calculated risk to help Ethan get a fresh start. My mom blamed the bank, claiming they were being unfair and aggressive with their demands. Neither of them acknowledged the gravity of what they had done. They weren't just risking their retirement or their house anymore, they were risking the livelihood of the employees who depended on the business and the legacy that had been built over decades. When I pushed for answers, they deflected. They said they couldn't just turn their backs on Ethan and insisted they still had options to fix things. Their refusal to take responsibility made it clear that this was a pattern they weren't willing to break. The word of the crisis spread quickly through the family. My aunts and uncles decided enough was enough and organized a family meeting. They invited everyone, including me, my parents, and Ethan. The goal was to figure out a way to address the financial mess and confront the favoritism that had caused it. Ethan showed up late, reeking of alcohol, and made no effort to apologize for it. While everyone else tried to have a serious discussion, he cracked jokes and rolled his eyes, clearly unbothered by the weight of what was happening. When someone asked him if he felt any responsibility for the situation, he laughed and said, "It's not my fault the business couldn't handle one loan." That was the moment the extended family turned on him. One by one, my relatives started calling out my parents for enabling Ethan's behavior. They pointed out how I had worked hard for everything I had, while Ethan had been handed opportunity after opportunity. My parents looked uncomfortable but still tried to defend Ethan, claiming he just needed more support to get back on his feet. The meeting escalated when Ethan accused me of turning the family against him. He stood up, pointed at me, and said I'd always been jealous of him. He claimed I was the reason his business failed because I refused to help. The room went silent. My uncle, who had been quietly observing up until that point, finally spoke up and told Ethan to sit down and take responsibility for his actions. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. After the meeting, I learned something that left me speechless. One of my uncles mentioned in passing that my parents had changed their will. They had decided to leave the entire family business to Ethan, cutting me out completely. The news wasn't entirely shocking, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. They had gambled the business to bail Ethan out, and now they wanted to hand it over to him entirely, despite his track record of destroying everything he touched. That was the last straw for me. I contacted a lawyer and formally removed myself from any legal ties to the family business. If my parents wanted to risk everything for Ethan, I wasn't going to be dragged down with them. It was a hard decision, but it was necessary. Without my involvement, the business began to decline rapidly. Ethan, predictably, had no idea how to manage it, and my parents were too preoccupied trying to clean up the financial mess they had created. Employees started quitting, and longtime clients began pulling their contracts. Meanwhile, my Reddit posts started gaining traction. Thousands of people shared their thoughts, advice, and similar stories. It felt strange to see my personal life laid out for so many strangers, but their support helped me realize I wasn't alone. Many encouraged me to keep focusing on my own happiness and leave the family drama behind. A week later, I received an emotional letter from my parents. They apologized for their actions, but the letter was laced with justifications and subtle guilt-tripping. It didn't feel genuine, it felt manipulative. They wanted me to step in and help save the business, but I knew better than to get pulled back in. Ethan, meanwhile, has been oddly quiet, or so I thought. A family friend recently told me Ethan is working on another big idea, one that could have even bigger consequences for everyone involved. I have no idea what he's is any indication. It's not going to end well. It didn't take long for Ethan to jump into his next scheme. This time, it was a luxury car rental business. He claimed he'd done extensive research and insisted there was a huge market for high-end vehicles rented out for events like weddings, music videos, and weekend getaways. Ethan pitched the idea to my parents as if he had already secured a fleet of cars and a long list of clients waiting to sign up. Despite everything that had happened with his previous failed business and their current financial struggles, my parents were all in. They used the last of their home equity to co-sign another loan for him. When I found out, I was furious. I told them point blank that this was a terrible decision, that Ethan had proven he wasn't capable of running a business. But they dismissed my concerns, accusing me of being unsupportive and holding a grudge. Predictably, the business crashed and burned almost immediately. Ethan spent most of the loan on leasing flashy cars and marketing the business with expensive, unnecessary extras. He rented an office in a luxury building downtown, claiming it was necessary to attract the right kind of clients. But he didn't budget for insurance, maintenance, or even a team to handle bookings and logistics. Within 3 months, the cars were being repossessed, and Ethan had nothing to show for it but unpaid bills and a growing list of angry customers demanding refunds. The fallout hit hard. My parents couldn't cover the loan payments, which meant they couldn't keep up with their mortgage either. They were forced to sell their home and move in with Ethan, who had already been struggling to pay his own rent. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents, who had bent over backward to support Ethan, were now depending on him for a roof over their heads. It didn't last long. Ethan's landlord received complaints from neighbors about unauthorized car rentals being run out of the apartment building. Apparently, Ethan had been using his place as a makeshift storage lot for the remaining vehicles, and tenants weren't happy about the increased noise and traffic. The landlord evicted him, leaving Ethan and my parents scrambling to find a place to stay. Meanwhile, I had been keeping my distance, focusing on my own life. Work was going great, and I had started seeing someone who genuinely supported me and encouraged me to maintain my boundaries. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally prioritizing myself. That peace was interrupted when I got a call from Ethan. He asked if I could let our parents stay with me temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. I refused, explaining that I couldn't sacrifice my space and stability for their poor decisions. Ethan didn't take it well, launching into a rant about how I was abandoning the family. I hung up before he could finish. Not long after, my parents reached out directly. They apologized for their past actions, but it was clear they expected me to step in and help them financially. Their tone was different, less demanding and more desperate. But the message was the same. I offered emotional support, reminding them that I was there for them in non-financial ways, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be bailing them out. By this point, even the extended family had run out of patience with Ethan. My aunts and uncles, who had initially tried to mediate and offer advice, began cutting him off financially and socially. One of my uncles, who had loaned Ethan money for his first business, publicly declared he was done enabling him. Without the backing of our relatives, Ethan was left completely isolated. To make matters worse, Ethan started facing legal trouble. Some of the customers from his failed car rental business filed lawsuits, claiming he had misrepresented his services and left them stranded after canceling their bookings. One particularly angry client posted a lengthy review online, detailing how Ethan had promised a luxury vehicle for their wedding but never delivered, leaving them scrambling for a replacement on their big day. The bad press spread quickly, and Ethan's reputation was in shambles. As all of this unfolded, I received a cryptic message from my parents. "We've lost everything. Can we talk?" For a moment, I wondered if this was another attempt to guilt me into stepping in. But something about the tone felt different. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to be good. The message from my parents caught me off guard, but after some thought, I agreed to meet them in a neutral public place. I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me wondered if it was another guilt trip, but something told me this meeting might be different. When we met, my parents looked more tired and defeated than I'd ever seen them. Over coffee, they began apologizing. It wasn't just a casual sorry either. They laid everything out. They admitted they had treated me unfairly for years, favoring Ethan and making excuses for his behavior. They acknowledged how much damage it had done to me and to the family as a whole. They said they were ashamed of how blind they had been. For the first time, they didn't try to justify their actions. As sincere as their apology sounded, I couldn't help but be skeptical. After everything that had happened, it was hard to trust their words. I listened but stayed cautious, waiting to see if there was more to the story. And there was. They told me they had decided to sell the family business. The debts were too much, and with Ethan's mismanagement, the business was barely breaking even. They said they wanted to use the money from the sale to pay off their debts and move into a smaller, more affordable home. They asked if I would help oversee the sale process, knowing I had experience with the business and its clients. I hesitated. I didn't want to get dragged back into the chaos, but I also didn't want to see the business and the people who worked there suffer because of my parents' poor decisions. I agreed to help with the sale, but I made it clear I wouldn't be involved beyond that. This was their mess to fix, not mine. Ethan found out about the decision a few days later, and to say he didn't take it well would be an understatement. He stormed into my parents' house, demanding to know why they were throwing away his inheritance. He accused them of betraying him, insisting the business could still succeed if they gave him one more chance. For the first time, my parents stood firm. They told Ethan he needed to take responsibility for his own life, and that they couldn't keep sacrificing everything for him. That didn't go over well. Ethan exploded, accusing me of brainwashing our parents and turning them against him. He claimed I'd been plotting to take everything away from him out of spite. It was classic Ethan, blaming everyone but himself for his failures. The sale process was as messy as I expected. Ethan sabotaged it at every turn, spreading rumors to potential buyers and even showing up unannounced to meetings. He claimed he had a right to be involved since it was his business. It was exhausting, but eventually we found a buyer who saw through the drama. The final sale price wasn't great, definitely less than what the business was worth at its peak, but it was enough to cover my parents' most urgent debts. After the sale was finalized, I felt a surprising sense of relief. I had kept my boundaries intact, helping without getting sucked back into the chaos. My parents thanked me, and for the first time, it felt genuine. They promised they were done enabling Ethan and were ready to start fresh. I hope they meant it. True to their word, my parents used the money from the sale to pay off their debts and downsize to a modest home. They joined a local support group for families dealing with financial recovery, and my dad even picked up a part-time job to keep busy. They seemed determined to rebuild their lives without falling back into old patterns. Ethan, on the other hand, continued to spiral. With no financial backing and no one left to bail him out, he burned through what little goodwill he had left. He bounced between low-paying jobs, struggling to hold on to any of them for more than a few months. Eventually, he stopped showing up at family events entirely. The extended family, who had already cut him off financially, stopped reaching out altogether. In therapy, I talked about how freeing it felt to finally prioritize my own needs. For so long, I had been caught up in the dysfunction, trying to fix things that weren't my responsibility. Letting go of that had been one of the hardest but most rewarding decisions I'd ever made. Just when I thought the dust had finally settled, I got a notification. Ethan had sent me a message. It was short and cryptic. "You can't hide forever. The truth about this family will come out, and everyone will see you for who you really are." I stared at the message for a moment before closing it. Whatever Ethan was planning, I wasn't going to let it drag me back into the chaos. For now, I'm focused on moving forward, but with Ethan, there's always another twist waiting around the corner. Not long after Ethan's cryptic message, I found out what his truth about the family was. He posted a long, rambling tirade on social media, accusing me of sabotaging his life and painting himself as the victim. According to Ethan, I had turned the family against him out of jealousy, manipulated my parents into selling the business, and stolen what should have been his future. At first, I braced myself for the fallout, but the post didn't land the way he thought it would. Instead of rallying support, it only highlighted how far Ethan had fallen. My extended family, who had witnessed years of his antics firsthand, were quick to shut him down. Several relatives commented directly, pointing out the opportunities Ethan had squandered and how much my parents had sacrificed for him. A few of his old friends chimed in too, calling him out for his inability to take responsibility. Ethan tried doubling down, but the more he posted, the worse he looked. Eventually, the post was deleted, along with most of his social media accounts. I heard through a mutual friend that Ethan had been quietly blocked by several people in his circle who were tired of his drama. Watching the situation unfold made me realize how much support I had, not just from my family, but also from friends who had been in my corner all along. Meanwhile, my parents were doing surprisingly well in their downsized life. They joined a financial recovery support group, which seemed to help them process everything they'd been through. My dad took a part-time job at a local hardware store, while my mom started volunteering at a community center. For the first time in years, they seemed grounded and content. They even started attending therapy, which I hadn't expected at all. Ethan, on the other hand, continued his downward spiral. Without anyone left to bail him out, he started burning through his remaining relationships. A former coworker told me Ethan had been fired from his latest job for missing too many shifts and blaming others for his mistakes. He moved in with a friend temporarily, but was kicked out after a fight over unpaid rent. While all this was happening, my life took a different path. My career had been thriving ever since I set those boundaries, and I landed a promotion that put me in charge of a major project at work. Around the same time, my partner proposed during a weekend getaway. It wasn't flashy or over the top, but it was perfect for us. For the first time, I felt surrounded by love and support that came without conditions or drama. We planned a small, intimate wedding and decided not to invite Ethan. It wasn't a hard decision. He had burned that bridge long ago. My parents came and, to my surprise, expressed how proud they were of me. During the reception, my dad pulled me aside and said they had been wrong about so many things, especially the way they treated me compared to Ethan. He promised they would never repeat those mistakes. It was a moment of reconciliation I hadn't expected, and while it didn't erase the past, it felt like a step toward healing. A few weeks after the wedding, I received an email from Ethan. It was short and vague, apologizing for some of his behavior, but also hinting that he was still angry about the way things had turned out. I didn't respond. Instead, I discussed it in therapy, where I reaffirmed my decision to protect my peace. I had worked too hard to set these boundaries, and I wasn't about to let Ethan pull me back into his chaos. The updates from Ethan's life became less frequent after that. I heard through the grapevine that he had moved out of state and was trying to start over. Part of me hopes he finds a way to turn things around, but I also know it's not my responsibility to fix him. Reflecting on everything, I can't believe how far I've come. There was a time when I felt trapped in the dysfunction of my family, constantly trying to prove my worth or earn their approval. Now, I'm in a place where I prioritize my own needs and surround myself with people who genuinely care about me. At a family dinner not long ago, my parents apologized again, this time unprompted. They admitted their favoritism had caused a lot of harm and promised to be better in the future. It's not something that can be fixed overnight, but seeing them take accountability was more than I ever thought I'd get. As for Ethan, I don't know what his future holds, but I've made peace with the fact that his choices are his alone. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to protect yourself, and in some cases, it's the only way to save your family too. Looking back, I'm grateful for the strength I found in myself and the support I discovered outside my immediate family. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that's more than enough.